All right, we are live. All right, everything's looking good. Go and subscribe to Dragons in Genesis. Ladies and gentlemen, Dragons in Genesis has a YouTube channel. Lots and lots of great content. Mostly podcast material you can listen to without having to see. Highly recommend everybody go subscribe to the YouTube channel. It is down in the description. He also has the website dragonsingenesis.com. You're going to want to go check that out as well. He's on all the many of the podcast platforms. You can listen to him audibly. Most of the stuff is audible, or if you will, an audio format, so you can actually listen and not have to watch. He is a trucker. He trucks a lot, so he's constantly listening and not able to drive and watch on video without killing a few people on the road. Not saying he hasn't done that before, but definitely go subscribe to his YouTube channel, subscribe to his podcast. If you like what you hear, you can go support him. He has what I like to just say is coffee.com, but it's the Ko-fi, however you want to pronounce it. You can give him a one-time, help show him some love. We have been pumping out that content here at MythVision. Thanks to Gnostic Informant in terms of the editing, John Dominic Crossan. We've dropped some more videos, lots and lots of more material. So everybody who goes and sees that early access to help support us in what we do here at MythVision, I hope more people will help out, because this is how I can do what I do full time. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope we can get a lot more people to help support us. I'm working very, very hard. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. So please consider helping us out. You can harass me in private chat there as well, asking questions and whatnot. Trust me, I like the harassment. With that being said, I got to get us kick-started because we're talking about Enoch, right? So maybe Enoch's not the only one worthy to open the scrolls, worthy to be seated at the right hand. Maybe MythVision is too. I don't know. You be a judge for yourself. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Host is Derek Lambert, and I have Jason from Dragons in Genesis joining me. How you doing, Jason?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Taking a chill pill. Got to sleep in a little bit. Been endlessly trying to chip away at this house. Contractor schedules are all weird as well, so I have to get out here in the garage. And while I have some small time, I figured let's talk about Enoch, because you're one of the guys we used to spend hours on the phone talking about what you're discovering with Enoch and stuff. Literally, we'd be hanging out on the phone while I was helping my sister-in-law move and all this stuff. You have the YouTube channel. We've got the plugs out of the way. Is there anything about those plugs you wanted to emphasize?
No, that's the main things. It is mainly an audio format podcast. So any place you get podcast, you can find me on YouTube, of course, but any podcatcher app like Good Pods, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spreaker, anything like that, you can find me just by searching Dragons in Genesis. And just look for the big orange logo with Godzilla on it, and that's me. And then, of course, the website, dragonsingenesis.com, you'll find, all sorts of resources on there, including links to the latest episodes. But yeah, that's really the main thing, as far as, those different resources and places where you can find me.
Absolutely. It is all in the description. It's everybody. Thank you for joining in the chat. Just want to give a special shout out real quick. What is up? The Uncle Jesus Show. Ethan, good to see you. Man, Bear, Pig. There was no Enoch. Nothing but fairy tales. It's still fun to entertain and learn about what is the author trying to do? Why are they trying to go back to Enoch? Antediluvian, why are they doing that? What's the purpose? And we're going to get into some of that stuff. Theophilus, good to see you in the chat. I did want everyone to join the Patreon if you can. I mean, keep in mind, it's only $3 American a month to join. And you can do the yearly sign up, which gives you 16% off or something like that. And you just have 12 months. And I think it comes out to 30 something bucks for the whole year. So for those who are broke, like my good friend Gerald, who said, wish I had money, we very po. It isn't expensive. People spend more on a Starbucks coffee one time than they would for an entire month to support what we're doing on this platform. Mark, good to see you here. Ruby Snow, Apollos in the chat. Baron, Ray Ashima is, you're doubting the hair spec. Look, if this isn't absolute evidence, this is taken July 6th, right? So we were up till 3:30 in the morning spraying the house, literally spraying the house. It is a water-based paint. So for those who are paint mythicists in the chat, who are absolutely convinced there is no existence of my painting and construction on my house, this may not convince you. I'm not sure how hardcore of a mythicist you are on my painting of my house, but I get this a lot. If you don't look like you're painting, well, Derek, you're not painting and it's a lie and you're making this up that you're working on your house and trying to remodel. I mean, we could go into videos, but all those must be fabricated too. All of the evidence based on my work that I'm trying to do to sell my house, my mom and dad's house, actually, to relocate to the West, it's all fake. This is how hardcore some people are about anything. Their skepticism goes so deep that they just, can't trust that I'm painting a house.
Well, I only live about an hour and a half away from you. So if people want to start a GoFundMe to pay for like gas and hotel expenses and food, of course, I'll go and do an in-depth investigation to determine if Derek Lambert is actually painting at his house.
Right.
I'll get photos, I'll get whatever people require. I'll actually get some paint samples. I'll get it on my finger.
Yes. You might need that. In fact, this is all green screen right here, right? This must be. So for those who don't believe me, right? You see this horrible, horrible mess. Let me put autofocus on so everybody can actually see what's going on here. That's not a sprayer, a paint sprayer right there. That is not, and next to it is not the container that is keeping the nozzle wet. That is not that. And no, this is not a mess from cleaning and trying to get the house prepped and stuff. None of that. That's not caulk over there. That's not caulk. And yeah, anyway, I've got no supplies. I'm not doing any construction. Everything I'm saying is a lie. And I'm just making it up as we go along. No, seriously. I just wash really well, because I take showers every day. And it's a water-based paint, which means it comes off pretty easily. Anywho, we're here for Enoch, aren't we? I mean, let's talk about Enoch. What the heck? I did the thumbnail and I was like, we could have talked about Job, but you talked about Enoch, the Second Temple Judaism, whoever this author is, most likely a Jew, they have a different strand of Judaism that's going on here. Can you talk about what you've discovered? Because when we first talked, you said, Derek, Enoch is a difficult situation to try and unravel the scholarship on it. They hold like seminars once a year, but there's not like endless Enochian scholars like you would on historical Jesus or New Testament studies.
Right.
So what have you discovered in your research on Enoch?
Yeah. So when I first started tackling the subject, it was basically listener request. They wanted me to cover Enoch. So I started researching it, and the more I looked into it, the more disappointed I became because the scholarship on it is very sparse. like you can't just go out and buy like a commentary on Enoch the way there are like 500 commentaries on the Bible. You look for a commentary on Enoch, and most of the stuff you get is full of conspiracy theories or young Earth creationism, all kind of stuff like that.
Kind of
The
like the Book
good,
of Revelation, where they like always talk about here's the
yeah.
signs of the yeah.
Oh yeah. The end of the world is coming, next year, and aliens might be involved, stuff like that. And like I'm not even joking. Like
Right. Oh,
you start
I
looking
know.
into Enoch, and it is full of ancient alien stuff. There's a ton of it. And I don't have the crazy hair like that dude on the History Channel does, so I can't do the ancient aliens thing.
So you're not saying it's aliens, but it was aliens. It's pretty much what you're trying to say.
Yeah. So I started looking into it, and it was frustrating. I got like about a dozen books, and I think maybe 2 of them were actually useful. And that was like after reading reviews about, I don't know, probably 100 different books. So these were the 12 best prospects that I had looked at, and most of them were garbage. And eventually I was able to find some good material on Enoch. And that took a while. And unfortunately, it's not something that the average person could just go out and buy. There's this 2-part book on Enoch. It's 2 volumes. And it's this fantastic commentary and explanation on the Book of Enoch. Unfortunately, it's about $90 per volume. So if you want to read good scholarly material about the Book of Enoch, you're going to pay almost $200 for it. And so it's just really not feasible for most people. So that's what I ran into, but I wasn't discouraged. So I got my hands on the best materials I could find, and I did my big coverage. But I didn't stop once I published the episodes. I think it was like 7 episodes that I published on Enoch. And when I finished, it was sort of like the Bible. The more I learned about it, the more curious I became, and the more I wanted to learn. So even though those episodes were published like a year and a half ago or something, I've still been researching about Enoch even more since then. And like the more I learn about it, the more fascinating it becomes. And
if I
actually,
may, Jason, this is important, I think, for our audience. Most may already know this, but I kind of want to introduce people to Enoch for a second. You have done wonderful interviews out here in the garage with me, actually, in the past, explaining what ends up happening in the Bible is you get this little this teaser. It's almost not even a trailer, right? You're like, Enoch,
it's like one sentence.
Walked with God and was not. And it's like, whoa, what the freak? Who's this guy that's supposedly so righteous? He's walking with God, and then boom, he's taken, and it's like lives 365 years, and that's it. Like, you don't get much. He's in this genealogy, and then that's it. And so Jews who are fascinated with their scriptures knew how to have such an imagination, would later on, under whatever circumstances they're currently under, found this way of creating commentaries and elaborating great stories out of these mysteries that kind of leave you with cliffhangers, and that's it. So they add these stories like the Book of Enoch. If you could tell us, so before we talk about the Book of Enoch, the Bible gives us a little teaser, and then what is the story of Enoch about? What the heck is it really trying to say? We'll dive into the mysteries and understanding what this book is about.
Okay, sure. So in the book of Genesis, right after you have the whole Cain and Abel story, we then get these 2 genealogies, one for Seth and one for Cain. And they're actually just 2 versions of the same genealogy. And it's essentially there to link Adam with Noah. And then they attribute one of these genealogies to Cain and one to Seth. But if you look at them, the names are like, most of the names are repeated. They're the same people. So one of the people in there, one of these pre-flood patriarchs, is this person called Enoch. And of course, when it lists these people, it tells how many years they lived, and they're all living like 800 and 900 years because they had like magic food back then. And then you get to this guy named Enoch, and it says he lived 365 years. But instead of saying that he died, it just says that he like walked with God, or, he went with God, and then he was not. He was just gone. And then the story just moves on as if it didn't just tell you that this guy flew up into the sky, And so it's like, what's this about, And then right after that, we get the story about how there are these sons of God, and they came down to earth, and they had sex with human women, and that created a race of evil giants that corrupted the entire world. So then God decided that he needed to send a flood to purify everything. And then in chapter 7, we get the story of Noah. And this is basically like where Enoch comes from. And there is still some scholarly debate as to whether or not this was a story that was abbreviated for Genesis, or if the story, like these lines in Genesis, were referencing a story that already existed. And you could make arguments either way. The fact that the people have said that the lines in chapter 6 where it talks about the angels coming down and having sex with humans, and then the giants are created and everything else, people have examined those lines and said that it looks really choppy, as if this was something much longer and they clumsily abbreviated the thing when they made chapter 6. And that certainly seems the case, especially since we have older myths that resemble this. So it does look like there was an older myth that Genesis like 4 through 6 are all, I think it was 4 through 6, are all like referring to. And of course, Enoch was a very important figure, and it does look a lot like solar worship. So it would make sense if there were older stories about this character before they began drifting toward monotheism. And so you could easily make the argument that while the book of Enoch itself didn't exist when Genesis was being compiled, some of these stories about these characters that are found in the book of Enoch, these stories did exist, and they're being referenced in Genesis. Now, as far as first Enoch, which is what we're talking about here, there are 3 books of Enoch. We're talking about the first one. It's a 5-part collection. It's made up of 5 different books. And this, it was specifically done as 5 books. And people actually think it was almost like their own version of the Torah. They were making, they're basically making their own Pentateuch. And there are some vague passages toward the end of First Enoch that almost seem like they're telling you that the Torah is corrupt, and like this is the correct scripture. And so the Jews that are over there in the temple, that are like holding up the Torah as like the authoritative word of God, it's almost like they're saying, no, that's corrupt. Those are heathens. This is the correct scripture.
If I may, Jason, this brings to my attention something interesting. Remember when Jesus says, for example, and I don't know if this is something to, but he says to the Pharisees, where he's like, in your own scriptures, it is written, almost like he's saying your scriptures, not mine necessarily. Like maybe he has a different canonical expectation or a different set in which he looks at as, hey, we have a reputable source we're going for. We think we have a better retelling of our ancestry. Kind of like I imagine a Pharisee would say to a Samaritan who had the Samaritan Pentateuch, right? They would have a disagreement here. So maybe Jesus is working with a different set of literature. And I just threw that out there as a possibility. I'm not sure. But Enoch, it does look like a Pentateuch. And it does something interesting just to throw out there. And I'm sure you can run with this. It literally wants to go before Moses. It doesn't like to dwell on Moses because certain Jews made Moses and the law like the primary thing. They wanted
Yeah.
to go before the flood to make it a much more universal, it appears, picture.
Yeah. So, in the same way that, these Jews were setting up Moses as this authoritative figure who, gives them the law and all the scriptures, and then you have these lines of text that say something like, if basically like if a prophet's words don't agree with the scripture of Moses, then is a false prophet and needs to be stoned, And so they're really trying to set the authority of Moses. He's this figure. Everything goes all the way back to him. So you can't really argue against these temple practices because their authority stems from Moses. And then you look at Enoch, and they're like, oh no, like Moses is this later guy who popped up, like thousands of years after our guy. Our guy gave the right scripture. And oh, look right here. We have this text that says other people, other prophets, Moses, are going to come along and they're going to corrupt the true word. And you shouldn't fall for it. You shouldn't fall for this Torah nonsense. You need to focus on the real thing. This was written by Enoch, and it was given to Moses or to Noah to be preserved during the flood. And that's how you have it today, because Noah kept it safe in like a waterproof pelican case on the ark, so it couldn't get rained on. Okay. And that's how you have it. It was passed on, and it says like to this very generation. And you're like,
Right.
oh, well, that's how I know that Enoch is the real scripture.
Okay, pause.
And of course, what this
real
is,
quick.
these are like all these different branches of Judaism that we're working with here.
This is important for the audience to catch. The author of 1 Enoch, or maybe authors, might be a group of Jews that are working together, are trying to convince you, just like Jubilees or other, Second Temple Judaism literature, they're trying to convince you that what they're writing is really by the hand of Enoch, okay? Because then the authority precedes Moses, and it's by a figure who was so righteous they got taken by God, right? Like, so
he didn't die; he turned into an angel.
This guy was so holy, you got to listen to him, not Moses. Moses is like a follower of this guy, the real truth for
Moses is just a prophet.
Right.
This guy became like an archangel. He lives in the sky. He's a star now. And so
he's
that's
seating
what the book of Enoch
he's
is.
Seated at the right hand of God, by the way. That's something else so this is one more thing I wanted to mention and get your thoughts on as we're diving into this. They're trying to precede Moses. They're trying to break the authority. Well, I recently spoke to Matthew Munger. He's a PhD Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He's also like a philologist. He has at least a master's in philology and whatnot. He's brilliant. We did one on Jubilees, and he did it mainly to show you, because he knows the Dead Sea Scrolls. He knows how Jubilees is understood in the fragments we have of Jubilees, but also how it was kept in the Ethiopian church and how it's been pretty preserved down to today. They were rewriting. This is the thing I want people to really emphasize. That whole inerrant, infallible, canonical, this is the real divine text and all of that. Get that out of your head. That was formulated much later by men at councils and such, because here, Jubilees, for example, which is another Second Temple Judaism book written probably in the 1st, 2nd century BC, maybe even contemporaneous in the 1st century. It's rewriting Genesis and Exodus, like completely different than what we have in our Bibles as Genesis and Exodus. So Jews were doing this with literature, and Enoch's doing this as well. Yeah. What we're trying to say is there is no, this is the true scripture. So obviously most skeptics already know that, but it's like, I want believers to start realizing this stuff, because they're being dishonest if they're not recognizing this.
Yeah. Another great example of this would be Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is just a rewriting of the books of Samuel and Kings. And if you look at them side by side, and I did, I think 2 episodes on Chronicles, just showing the parts where they take Samuel and Kings and then they change it, where they literally just take a chapter from Samuel and then they rewrite it and they make all these different changes, and so I go through the First and Second Chronicles, just showing all the different changes that they're making, as they're going from the source material, which was Samuel and Kings. And Samuel and Kings was another rewrite of their history, just as much of Deuteronomy rewrites some of the events from like Genesis through Numbers. And of course, even that, all of these things, basically every person who came to power in Jerusalem wrote a new version of their history. That's what all of it is. Like the events of Judges, that never happened. This was basically people creating a new history. The same thing with Joshua. And so just as the Torah was a version of history written by one group of people, Enoch is in some ways another version of history being written by another group of people. Though it's not as concerned with history as most of the Old Testament is, Enoch does talk about history in a few places. And it's fascinating because their history is a bit different. They don't seem to really know much about the Exodus story. When they talk about Moses, they seem to be talking about this guy who's just a prophet. He's not some great national leader. He's just a guy who had like visions or something. And so the idea that, these people were like held captive for like 400 years and stuff, that doesn't seem to have been held by all of the Jews. Actually, there's a scene in First Chronicles where it's recounting these things, and when you get past the time of Joseph, and it's talking about these genealogies and stuff of these different, these different like Jewish leaders and stuff of the different tribes, it's talking about some of these guys and all the stuff that they're doing in Judah and Israel during the time they're all supposed to be locked up in Egypt. And so at the beginning of Chronicles, it's telling you that the Jews are all living in the promised land. And they're having battles with people, they're founding cities and everything else in Israel. And this is like right after the time of Joseph, and before the time of Moses. And it's like, wait, this guy is using material in which there is no Exodus story. And there's another one. I can't remember the name of the text. I've got it in my notes somewhere. But there's one where it talks about Moses, and he's a prophet. He's a Samaritan. He lives in the northern kingdom, and his whole commune with Yahweh is up on a mountain, and he's a Samaritan. And the whole thing takes place in the northern kingdom of Israel. And it's like, wow. So this character, the Moses character, was repurposed for the Exodus story. It was never about an Egyptian, Exodus. This is a later story, and so
Jason,
it's like
I was reading the Bible Unearthed recently by Israel Finkelstein, and
great book.
I emailed him, by the way. I've emailed him over the years, and he's always been too busy. But he emailed me back and said, "I'm in the middle of digs. Let's connect in the fall because I'll be in Israel in October." Oh, nice. His book, he deals with the hard facts. I'll get to your super chats in just a moment. If you have any questions, feel free to super chat them. Thank you for the support. It really helps us out. But in his book, like he's showing what the facts of the evidence based on the digs and archaeology we have of when things were happening, and using more than just the Bible sources, like sources from the Assyrians and the Babylonians, you name it, and being able to kind of put this big map in your mind and connecting dots of when things were really happening and then when the literature's acting like it's happening. And every single time, it's a very detailed, complex book to read. I was getting deep into it, and I had to keep drinking coffee because when those books are like heads hurting type stuff. But it was like everything that was happening in the 12th, 13th century BC was really taking place in the 7th century, or right there around 700, 800, 600s BC when all this stuff was really happening. So they kept projecting their timeline way back, but the real stuff that was happening that we actually know was taking place was 7th, 8th century. So I'm thinking to myself, like, this seems to be like a thing that people do, and it's probably not just Israelites or the Jews that would do this kind of stuff. Probably many people had foundation myths and things like that they wanted to
Oh
push
yeah,
back. But if they're a
yeah, it's
conquered
common.
nation, yeah. But I mean, it's amazing how you'd have Moses be a Samaritan, you'd have Moses be this, you'd have him here. I mean, even if you look at what is it, Manetho, the Egyptian priest, who
Hmm.
rewrites Moses, as we know, Russell Gamirkan has brought this stuff to the table.
Yeah, yeah,
Really interesting stuff. Whether you draw his conclusions, Manetho does talk about this evil priest named Moses who leaves
yeah,
Egypt. He was an Egyptian priest too, by the way, supposedly. He leaves
yeah.
Egypt and goes and builds a temple in Judea.
Hmm.
Like our Bible story, he says he doesn't even leave. Now, maybe a complete myth, and he's just trying to slam the
Yeah,
Jews and attack their guy. Whoop-de-doo. The point is, like, everybody's doing weird stuff with these characters.
yeah. There's actually this book that I think everyone should read. It's called From Gods to God, and I cannot remember the name of the author right now. You can find it on Amazon. From Gods to God, and there's a chapter in there about how these redactors were manipulating the story of Moses because they didn't want people to worship him. And that's the reason why he doesn't make it into the promised land. He gets killed off before he can get in there, because their older versions of the Exodus story, he does go into the promised land, and they're like, no, we can't have him even go there. He needs to get punished. We need to take him down a peg. And they're like, he actually shows how people are taking these other stories that are based off of Moses, like the story of Elijah, which he actually goes through this whole big thing showing how the story of Elijah is based on Moses. And of course, it ends with him being taken up into heaven the same way Enoch is. And it's like, yeah, where would he get this idea that Elijah is flying up into heaven if he's basing it off of Moses? And it's like, that was the thing. He was actually supposed to get into the promised land. And then once there, go up on a mountain and ascend into heaven. And these redactors are like, man, there are too many people worshiping Moses like a god, which originally he probably was. As like Samson and Enoch and Elijah and everybody else, they seem to have just been sun gods. And so they basically go through and they're like, okay, well, let's try to insult Moses a little bit so people won't worship him. So he doesn't go into the promised land. He gets he needs to be punished. Let's make it something like ridiculous. Oh, he touched a rock instead of just shouting at it. Okay, that's good enough punishment. Or oh, you know what? He's not circumcised, that filthy Philistine. And so they just throw in all these little details to say, look, you can't worship this guy. And oh, look, no one even knows where he was buried. So those shrines you have that you're going over and making, offerings to, those are all fake because no one actually knows where his bones
Josephus does
are.
something
You
weird.
know, so yeah.
Josephus later actually takes him and ascends him. So there's like a
Mhm.
later tradition where he's
Yeah,
like,
they
nah,
think.
he didn't die. He actually was taken, and just like Enoch, they're actually
Yeah,
doing
they
that.
think that Josephus may have been referencing another version, maybe even an older version of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Because like we said earlier, all these things kept getting rewritten over and over and over again. Just as Samuel and Kings were rewritten into Chronicles, so that the Levitical priests could always come out as the heroes. Um, you have people who are taking these stories about Moses and they're going to rewrite them. And sometimes it's the older versions that we're left with, and sometimes it's the rewrites. And so, these things where, like his family members suddenly get upset because he's got a wife from like Nubia. And it's like, wait, what's going on here? And well, or was it Ethiopia? Where was his wife from? Anyway,
I thought she was Ethiopian or something, but
yeah. So anyway, they get all upset, and it's like, well, hang on, like, where's his detail coming from? Because it doesn't say anything about this, Like,
this
did this
is the
happen when he
exact
ran away
problem.
from Egypt for a while and before he met Yahweh? What's going on here? And it's like,
That's the
well, there was
problem, though,
another chapter of the
Jason.
story, and we don't have it anymore. It got chopped out.
That's exactly the problem, though. Exactly
Hmm.
what you're describing. So here, Moses has a wife. and they're making a big fuss of it. Why? They wouldn't have made this fuss in the 12th century or the 13th century when Moses supposedly is running around. This is exactly what Israel Finkelstein is trying to describe. We know under Ezra, Nehemiah, the Josiah reform, that was a concern in Babylon and in this area with the Assyrians and what was going on, because God's people are starting to diminish and be mixed into the multitudes and like foreign gods, you name it. So all of that is projected back onto these little stories about Moses and his wife. And it's like, they wouldn't have gave a crap in the 12th, 13th century. Right. They gave a crap under Josiah's reform. So a lot of the history that we're reading about, it's mythology, but there's a kernel of reality being projected back onto these mythological narratives. And that's what I'm finding. I think Enoch might play a significant role in this as well. Let's get these super chats real quick. And then rabbit trail wherever you want to go with this. Thank you so much for the support. Apollos, Christian Apologetics, thank you for the super chat. And there might be a debate. I'm trying to set one up on low and high Christology in Paul with Apollos. So Escala argued the similitudes didn't belong yet to the Second Temple, but alluded to at cursory level, like other disconnected traditions by church. Thoughts?
So one of the problems with the similitudes of Enoch is this is one of the sections of Enoch, so it's divided into 5 different sections. And one of these sections, they were unable to find any fragments of it at Qumran. And so some people said, aha, that must be a later writing. And it must have been like a Christian writing. And we've seen this sort of thinking pop up numerous times. Anytime something pops up and, it doesn't seem to coincide with, the things that we find in, say, the Masoretic text, then people say, well, that must have been something that the Christians just made up. But there's a couple problems with that line of thinking. First off, the type of language that's used in there, while it does seem in some ways sort of Christian, a lot of talk about the Son of Man and the elect one and things like that, it's no more Christian than something like Isaiah, Zechariah, or Daniel. It's the same type of language. And in fact, if you were to compare it to some of these later writings, like, say, Revelation or the Ascension of Isaiah, which are very similar in theme and style, the language is different. It doesn't match up with that. Those are explicitly Christian, and the similitudes, they don't match up with that. They haven't reached that state in their evolution yet. So it doesn't look like something that is that late. Another problem with that particular notion that it needs to be rejected as a pre-Christian writing and should instead be considered a Christian piece of literature is that we know for a fact that the people at Qumran, they didn't have copies of everything. I mean, look at the book of Esther. That's the only book of the Old Testament they didn't have. Now, does that mean that Esther was written by Christians? Well, of course not. It just means that there weren't copies that survived. And when archaeologists were excavating at Qumran, they saw evidence that people had looted those caves, in prior centuries. So it's very, we know that things were already missing. And a lot of these texts were so damaged that they came out in fragments the size of your thumbnail. So just because a section of Enoch couldn't be found at a place doesn't mean that it was the product of a much later date. It just means that the text didn't survive. Even though they had, I think, like 11 copies of Enoch at Qumran that we know of, because we found them in 11 different parts, these things were so damaged and so fragmentary that you can't even, if you take all 11 and you put them together, you don't even have 20% of the entire book. But that's how damaged it was. It's little tiny scraps and fragments. Easy for, one section of it to just be completely destroyed. especially since these things were, contained on like separate scrolls and things. Um, the style and everything, scholars have looked at it, and right now the consensus is that it's probably second century BC, which a lot of the stuff in there kind of looks like that, and other parts of Enoch seem contemporary with that time period. So probably second century BC, maybe as late as first century BC. Um, but as far as it being later than that, the language, it looks older. And when you compare it to something like, say, Daniel or Zechariah, when you find where it's talking about these similar themes, the language, and the ideas seem like you know uh, they're all in that same state of evolution. It hasn't evolved to the point of like this fully realized Christ figure that we find at like the end of the first century and into the second century AD.
Is it fair to say too, like in light of this, we know that Daniel gets reinterpreted in the literature we have, let's go ahead and just say late first century book of Revelation, it gets reinterpreted to be Rome. So if
Mhm.
Enoch was being written that late, they would have
Mhm.
implied Rome in this text somehow, but instead we have kingdoms that match what Daniel's describing, things that are
Mhm.
going on, and we have good reason to think Daniel's written second century BC,
Yeah.
the latter half, of course. But so something like that, you can kind of look at internal evidence to suggest, apart from just looking at how old the language might be or whatnot, there are other reasons to think that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What the similitudes of Enoch? So it's talking a lot about like these visions. It's basically like three different visions that he has, and this is chapters 37 to 71 of First Enoch. And what it is, it's three different apocalyptic visions, similar to what you would find in something like Revelation. And basically, you have this figure who is taken on this journey. So Enoch gets picked up by the angel Uriel, and he gets flown around. He gets to see everything. He gets a tour of the universe, and he has these visions. And in these visions, he sees all these different things happening, and it includes things, like the end of the world. There's like, all this destruction and this celestial figure who is either called the elect one or the Son of Man, depending on which vision you're reading from. Um, he comes along and he does all of these things. The bad people are punished, the good people are rewarded, and he's going to sit in heaven and judge over everything and all the rest. Um, and a lot of people would read this and say, "Oh, wow, that's like very Christian." But all of these things already existed in the Old Testament. And the fact that he at no point does he come out and say anything about this figure, giving him a name like Jesus, is a pretty good giveaway that this is a pre-Christian writing. And another thing is that at the end of the vision, Enoch himself, like his flesh all melts away and he becomes an angel and he flies up into heaven, and they're like, "You are the Son of Man." And it's like, oh my God. And you realize that this great like celestial figure that everyone is, anticipating the arrival of is actually someone who came like centuries before the flood. And that is where all of this is coming from. And it's like, it's this sort of archetypal character that keeps getting recycled, and like Enoch is the original, and then you have like Moses and Elijah, and then later Jesus are sort of like
Right.
retellings of the same sort of figure. He's here to kind of set the record straight, get people back on the right path, and then when he's all said and done, he's just going to ascend bodily up into heaven. Um, so yeah, that's why a lot of scholars think that it is a pre-Christian writing, because um, it lacks any of the characteristics that we find with that sort of writing from the Christian period. Like they never say anything about the Christ ever, not once in there. They're talking about this Son of Man or elect one figure, and in one of the visions it turns out to be Enoch.
Hmm.
So there are a few other different reasons, but But
There's probably
that's
a
really the
lot
main
more
one.
that we're just not even touching on. I'm
Yeah.
sure, that
And
like
even if it
experts.
was, a Christian writing, it still wouldn't matter because it was either important to early Christians or it was written by early Christians. Either way, it was important to early Christians, and there's really no indication that it comes after the Gospels. So yeah, if it is a Christian writing, then it likely predates the writings of Paul. But I don't think it's a Christian writing. I think it's, early first century or mid second century BCE.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that, Apollo's Ruby Snow. Thank you for the super sticker. I didn't see a comment or a question. I was just checking to make sure. I really appreciate the support. Probably just showing love and enjoying the show. Thank you so much for that. Someone said, you guys are right about the scriptures being written. Do you think it can happen again? I mean, there are small groups that I think do it, but like breaking down creeds and stuff with Orthodox, I think certain movements would have to become popular in order for that to become a trend or something that people are willing to rewrite the mythology of the Bible for modern day. And it would be wonderful if they did, like in large amounts of people. Instead, everyone wants to reach back to church fathers and hold on to old faith and old creeds and things like that. I think it'd be better. I would want your comment on this, and then I want to ask you about Michael Heiser in particular, what you've maybe seen or engaged in terms of his topics, of what he talks about, because I think he actually believes giants really existed and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, what do you think about this question here?
I think in a way, like the Bible is gradually being rewritten. I mean, every time a particular ministry gets a new copy of their Bibles printed, if you grab it and compare it to the previous version from just a decade earlier, you're going to notice changes. I have two different copies of the King James Gideon Bible, and you can't get past the first page without seeing changes. And so this is the same version of the Bible from the same sources being printed by the same printing company, paid for by the same church, and it's different. And like you look at anything like this, you look at the Bibles that are being produced for like the Southern Baptist Convention or Pentecostals or whomever, the Catholics, anybody. Look at them from one decade to the next, and you're going to see differences. I think I have 3 different Catholic Bibles. And again, you can't make it past chapter 1 without seeing changes. And these are the official unchanging word of God straight from the Vatican. And every decade it's different, and that as much as belief comes from scripture, scripture likewise comes from belief. And when your beliefs no longer coincide with scripture, well, then you just get a new interpretation and you make the scripture fit the belief. I mean, that's what the King James Bible was. It was a Church of England version of it. Deliberate changes were made. Even look at the Masoretic text. Once we started finding things at the Dead Sea Scrolls, then all of these changes that people had assumed the Christians had made, they started looking at them and said, it turns out that the Jewish scribes were deliberately making these changes. They're the ones who made Goliath 9.5 feet tall. They're the ones who said, Satan did this. That wasn't God. It's like, oh no, the original said God did it. And so you've got all these weird little changes like that. And people are still doing it today. It's on a much smaller scale. It's slower. It's more subtle. It takes, decades and decades for little changes to creep in instead of a sweeping rewrite. But grab a Bible today and then find the same type of Bible, the same version from the same ministry from 30 years ago. And you'll see that they are different. So, and a lot of it, like a lot of these things, a lot of these changes, it'll be things concerning like race, homosexuality, slavery, things like that. The congregations are no longer comfortable with what their Bibles say, so they just make new Bibles that say what they want them to say. So yeah, it's the Bibles are getting updated. They are changing.
Thank you for that question. As far as Michael Heiser, do you have any insight or input that you would like to make a comment about? I saw a question earlier in the chat about Michael Heiser.
I'm trying to think of anything in particular.
Now you know who
That's
he is.
definitely, yeah.
Okay.
He has this book called The Unseen Realm.
Right.
If you want to get sort of like an insider's view about some of these strange beliefs that Enoch and early Christians, seem to present, then something like The Unseen Realm is going to expose you to some things that you're not going to find if you're reading material from secular sources. That this is, this is a person who believes in these things, and I think his idea of Christianity in some ways is lost to like most modern churches. And this idea that there are these evil spirits running around and they're causing all this trouble, and there's this like great cleansing, and the way the whole atonement thing works and stuff like that, which is a very complex mythology that Enoch really deals with. A lot of that has sort of been lost as it's been like reimagined throughout the centuries, which is why a lot of modern Christianity doesn't make sense. And I think that Michael Heiser's view, while I don't think it's completely accurate as far as like what the early Christians believed, um, I do think that he does a good job of giving us an insider's perspective about what these people believed, and maybe notices things that a more secular individual wouldn't see because we're not believers.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
so
there's a
like,
different level in which you absorb the material when you're thinking that way. I'll listen to
yeah,
him and he'll say
eh,
things that Paul says, and I'll be like,
mm,
I never actually thought that might be what Paul's thinking in his
yeah,
connection of being like a absorbing the literature of his Bible, his Septuagint. But yeah, you're
yeah,
right on that. You're right on this. I think there's some
yeah,
things we can learn, but at the same time, imagine this is also someone I think that bends over backwards to try and like say, there are real we found the fossils of
yeah,
real giants, or like they imagine the New Testament authors, they probably really believed Adam was the first man on planet Earth.
mm,
They really believed giants probably existed and came down, and who knows what, the whole nine with angels, or if you will, demons, however you want to call them. They come down and they married daughters of men and reproduced and made giants and stuff. There are probably people who really believe that are writing these New Testament books, or Paul himself. And here is a man, Michael Heiser, who actually believes that himself. So while you're obviously going to get a believer's perspective, you can learn from it, I think, even if you're like, yeah, why are you drawing those conclusions? Fine,
yeah,
learn, I
yeah.
guess.
I think it is important to, like study from good peer-reviewed secular scholars, but don't forget that this is a belief system, that comes from people who are uh, trying to understand the world through this ancient lens, and they they're wrapped up in this sort of mysticism. And so hearing a person who actually believes these things, who believes that there are these like spirits flying around doing these things, that will help you to understand some of these bizarre connections that are being made by these ancient authors. It allows you to get into their heads a bit better. And then when you do that, then you go through and you read something like Enoch and you're like, oh, that makes a lot more sense now. And if you're only listening to someone explain it, in a very sterilized manner, you may not comprehend it the same way. You may not be able to make those same connections and
Mhm.
understand things. So yeah, like I don't think we should ignore what a believer says. I think we should actually look at it, because it can shed new light on these topics, because it was believers who wrote the gospels and the letters of Paul, Revelation, Daniel, everything. you know So we need to hear what they have to say, because they can shed light on it that someone, like a secular scholar can't. So I think it is important to look at those things, and just keep in mind that this is a person who's trying to make reality fit into a certain mystical model. So it's look at that to get a deeper understanding of how believers may have interpreted these texts that they were reading.
Yeah, there's all sorts of interpretations. I want to get back into Enoch for a moment, since we didn't have any questions or any super chats there. Enoch talks about these giants, and he goes into great detail about massive giants. I mean, like big.
They're huge.
Yeah. So can you tell us about? That's what I'm saying. Like, go into this a little bit. Can you go into the flood narrative that is found in 1 Enoch, and then also I'd like to get into the animal apocalypse a little too. I'd like to touch in.
Oh yeah, yeah. The animal apocalypse is great.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, First Enoch, which is called the book of the first book of it, called the Book of Watchers. That's the one everyone loves to focus on, because I mean it's got vampire giants and angel sex and all kind of good stuff. Okay, that's the one you want to make a movie about.
Right.
And they did that. The movie, the Noah movie that came out a few years ago, with Russell Crowe. That is based more on First Enoch than it is from the biblical narrative. There's actually some details in there that some people were like, "Why'd you put that in there?" And
the big stone-looking watchers, right? Like, where did that come from?
And then at the end of it, where they're like, some of them, because these are like these angels, they got cast down because they were evil, and then some of them got redeemed, and they broke out of their stone bodies, and they became these beings of light and flew up into heaven. I was actually talking with David Fitzgerald a couple years ago about that, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't understand why they did that part, but I guess it was cool to see him redeemed." And I'm like, no, that's in Enoch. That's in the Book of Watchers. There's actually a section in there, really brief. I think it was in the Book of Watchers. It's somewhere in First Enoch. But there is this part in First Enoch where some of the Watchers, they get redeemed and they fly up into heaven. And it's like, yeah, the guy who wrote the script, he studied the hell out of this, because it's this brief passage, and if you blink, you'll miss it. And he caught that and he put it in there. And so I thought that was a really, really cool detail to throw in there. But yeah, so in First Enoch, you have these angels. They're just called or they're not actually called angels. They're called the sons of God. Okay. And in Enoch, they're understood to be like angels. But then again, what's the difference between an angel and a lesser deity? It's the same thing, so some of them come down to earth, and there are 3 different versions of this story in there. In one of them, they're led by an angel named Simahaza, and he comes down and he's like, "Oh, look, there are all these women and they're all beautiful." And so he gets all of his horny angel friends, and they make a pact. Like, "Look, we're going to get in trouble for this, so we're going to probably have to live on Earth forever. But you take one look at these women, and you're going to be like, yeah, it's totally worth it." And so they all land on this mountain, and then they disperse among the population, and they have sex with all these human women. And these women give birth to these babies that are like these weird, monstrous humans, and they just keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger. In another version of the story, they're led by the angel Azazel. And his thing, it's more of like a Prometheus story. He's going to take all of this knowledge from the gods, and he's going to bring it down to earth and start handing it out. And he teaches them some truly horrible things like warfare and mascara. And I'm not lying. Beautifying the eyes is it's horrible. It'll ruin things, apparently.
But agriculture, all of that.
Yeah. They learn how to tell the future and how to discern meaning from thunderstorms and stuff like that. and they learn makeup, you know, and this like corrupts the entire world. And then they try to sort of harmonize these two by saying Azazel came down first and he taught the women makeup, and then that attracted all the other angels who then came down to earth. And so they try to take these two different stories. Okay, well, Azazel got it started with the makeup, you know, and they all started like an OnlyFans page or something. And then the horny angels came down.
You gotta blame, of course, they gotta blame the girls, you know, for the reason all this stuff happens, of course.
Yeah. And then there's a third one where 7 angels try to, and they're depicted as stars. And then also they're depicted as a constellation, and they try to come out at the wrong time of the year. And because of that, El Elyon, he just smacks them down, and they're thrown down to earth, and they crash in the desert and make this huge fire out in the desert. And that ends up corrupting everything. And that goes into this whole other thing that we could do a whole episode just on that. It's some weird stuff. But getting back to that angel sex, because everyone wants to know about that. I don't know what positions they used. I don't know. But they made a bunch of Nephilim babies, and they grew up to be 3,000 ells tall, which comes out to be about 4,500 feet. Which, if you're one of those like filthy metric communists, then that's about 1 kilometer. But we don't do that here. We'll like measure it in Coke machines or, you know, something appropriate. I don't know the conversion to ferrets, but you know, you can figure it out. But about 4,500 feet tall, or 1 kilometer. And they started eating everything. Now at the time, because it's before the flood, everyone was vegetarian. Okay. Well, they ate up all the vegetables. Like, they ate all the trees and everything, because they're almost a mile tall. Like, you know, to them, a tree is like broccoli, and you could eat like a bag full of that. So they're cleaning out forests and everything else. They eat all the plants on Earth. And then they're like, well, we're going to have to eat all the animals. And that had never been done before. So they start gobbling up all the animals, you know, the T-Rexes and stuff. They were all vegetarian dinosaurs, and they're gobbling up all of them. And then once that's done, they're like, well, there's no more animals. Let's start eating the people. So then they start gobbling up all the people. And the people, they start screaming, and their voices are heard all the way up in heaven. And the archangels, they're like, man, like this is pretty bad. And they go up to the great high God, to El Elyon, and they're like, yo, El, did you know that like some of the angels went down there and they made some Nephilim? And they're like,
real quick comment though. Real quick
people?
comment. The name of God here is El, right? It's not.
Yeah,
it doesn't. Yeah. They don't refer to Yahweh in this, if I'm not mistaken.
No. They're talking about the God Most High. They keep talking about it's like the Most High God. So we're talking about El Elyon, the father of the Canaanite pantheon. Okay,
got it.
They do talk about, in the book of Enoch, they do talk about Yahweh. And Yahweh and El are always two separate entities in the literature of First Enoch. They are two separate gods. They serve different roles. So yeah, they're talking about El Elyon and the archangels. I think it was Michael, but I'm not positive. He goes and he's like, yo, El, the giants, they started eating people. Like, there's this horrible stuff going on. Like, what are you going to do about it? And he's like, oh crap, I didn't even notice this. Like, so apparently he didn't know. He had no clue. And then by this point, the giants, they were starting to run out of people. So they started drinking each other's blood. So we got a really ancient version of, like, you know, kilometer tall vampires running around the earth. Okay. So this is really bad news. So that's when he's like, okay, we gotta deal with this. So he sets his archangels to go out and capture all of the fallen angels, wrap them up in chains, and throw them in these big pits in the desert and cover them up with rocks. Though in some versions, the pits are also on fire. Okay.
This sounds like the Titans.
Yeah. So get them all, toss them in there, cover them up. They're sealed away. Don't have to deal with them anymore. Now you got to do something about the Nephilim, because you got the big blood-sucking giants running around. So they go and they start, they they basically take Azazel's own weapons, which is knowledge, and they use it against him. They teach the Nephilim how to conduct war, and they start killing each other. And the poor watchers, they're sitting down in their pits, chained up, and they're watching all of their children kill each other. And so there's like these like giant battles on Earth. And so, the poor people are sitting there looking up, and they have like these, 4,500 foot tall giants chopping each other up with like half-mile long swords or whatever. So they start killing each other. And then they're like, okay, now that they're doing all that, it's really time to deal with this problem. We're going to send a flood and we're going to kill everything. And then the watchers, they're like, oh man, I feel kind of bad. So they go to Enoch. They say, Enoch, can you help us out, man? We feel kind of guilty. We're sorry. Can you ask El Elyon to show some mercy on us? Can you intervene on our behalf? And so Enoch, he goes into a trance and he has this vision, and he asks El, he's like, can you maybe go easy on the watchers? And this really gets into the whole purpose of Enoch as a character. He's meant to be a sort of emissary between heaven and earth. And that's like his role throughout the Enochic literature. He's this intermediary, not just for the watchers, but for people too.
There's no other name on earth by which, what is it? There's no other name, I was going to say, by which watchers can be saved other than the name of Enoch. But anywho.
Yeah, so it's decided that, look, they transgressed the natural order, and it's not going to work out for you. Sorry, guys. And so God decides the earth is getting flooded, and that's going to get rid of everything. The problem, though, is that the spirits of the Nephilim are so evil, and their evil is so potent that even after they're all dead and the watchers are all sealed away down in their little desert dungeon, the spirits of the Nephilim, these corrupt vampire giants, are still around. And so the perfect creation is still corrupted. And because of this, you have to have this annual atonement festival. And the way it works is you get these two goats, and one of them is the pure goat, and you bring it into the temple and you sacrifice it, and you kind of splash the blood around because the temple represents all of creation, and the blood goes out and it touches all of creation, this purifying blood. And then you take, and that's basically to link all of creation with this goat, who is to be sacrificed either in place of Yahweh or as Yahweh. The instructions, that particular line can be interpreted either way. So the goat may actually represent Yahweh. And then you then take the blood and you put some of that blood on the evil goat. And then you go out to the desert and you throw it in the pit where Azazel is locked up. And so the pure blood touches all of creation. It gathers up all of the evil that comes from the children of the watchers, these Nephilim, all of their corrupting spirits, and is then transferred into this goat that is cast out into the desert, into the pit. I'm wondering if
Gehenna, I wonder if at one point they were throwing the goat into the little valley of Gehenna where the trash was being burnt. Just an idea.
Possibly.
You never know.
Yeah,
that's where hell actually comes from.
Yeah, and so you do that, and then that basically, it keeps the universe operating, the way it should for another year. And then, of course, the following year, you have to conduct the same atonement ritual, and you have to do it on a specific day of the year. And the third book in First Enoch, the Book of Astronomy, it goes really heavy into this and tells why it needs to be done at a certain day of the year. And if you get it wrong, and it's easy to get it wrong if you don't use the right calendar, and they tell you do not use a lunar calendar, you'll screw it all up. And then if you don't do it, you can't atone properly, and then the world will end. And that's why they have this apocalyptic view, because by this point, the second temple had switched to a lunar calendar, and it's supposed to be on a solar calendar. And because of this, their days are off by like 11 days a year. So they're conducting these sacrifices at the wrong time. And so they're like, okay, our atonement sacrifice isn't going to work because it's not done at the right time. And, because of that, it can't match up with the events in heaven. In Enochic literature, they view the world as a duplicate of what's going on in heaven. And so the temple, like the center of it, is supposed to represent the actual house that God lives in up in the sky above the firmament. It's not like you made this temple and then God made a similar. No. The temple is meant to be a copy of his, and there were like 7 of them. And like everything on Earth, like if there's a river on Earth, it's actually a copy of a real river up in the sky.
Mhm.
And events are also taking place at the same time. And so this purification in the heavens needs to be met with a purification on Earth on the same day. Otherwise, it won't work properly and the world won't be purified. And you can only do this if you have the right calendar. If you use the lunar calendar, then you're going to be off and you're going to get it wrong, and you'll do it on the wrong day. The magic won't connect and the world will still be impure. And year after year, it will just get worse and worse and worse. And eventually it'll become too great and the world will end. Like heaven and earth will be destroyed. We're all going to die. It'll be just this raging inferno as God finally gets fed up with us and decides to purify the world with fire. And this is where your little prediction from Daniel comes in, where you're going to have a certain amount of time beginning with the second temple when they started using this lunar calendar until the time when it all goes to hell in a handbasket and everything gets destroyed because they've got the wrong calendar. And
there is something to note too, is you and me talked about this in the past. There's like a foundation stone that the temple is built to block the waters, because when the flood story is talking about waters from above and below, the windows of heaven open, meaning there's like little gates that open, letting water out because they thought the blue sky was water, and then in the earth. And so they have this capstone on the temple. And if we didn't keep this ritual, like you said, on the correct day, eventually the temple itself, which is a reflection of the world, it's like the microcosm of the macrocosm. The temple represents the universe. The temple itself, when it's destroyed and that stone is removed, you're going to open up the floodgates again and destroy the earth as a potential. I'm not saying that Enoch is expecting water again, but they capped that hole, they thought, that was beneath where the temple was built. That was where the flood comes from. And it's like, oh, what the heck? This is crazy.
See, what this is at the beginning of time, the gods, they were all fighting with this great water dragon called Leviathan, and no one could beat him or her, depending on which version you read. And then Yahweh comes along and fights Leviathan, possibly dies during the combat, and is then resurrected through the power of either El Elyon or the goddess Anat. We're not sure which. And then because of that, the god, the dragon Leviathan, which represents the primordial ocean, his body gets chopped in half. Half of it gets put up above the firmament, and that's where the great sky ocean is. That's where rain comes from. And the rest of it is now down below the world. And so it's no longer just a giant water world with like Kevin Costner. There's like dry land now. And so you have all this water down below the surface. And the world is set up on these giant stone pillars and everything else. And you have this threat from the Tehom, the waters of the deep that's down beneath, that it could always come back up again. And to prevent it, you have this giant capstone in the hill country of Judah, and there's a temple built on it. And this capstone, it protects the entire universe, and it holds down the waters of the Tehom. And so that little spring that you can get to in Jerusalem, where you can like walk down this little cave and there's like you have access to water so they can like survive long sieges. You're getting to the water of the Tehom by doing this, And if ever the temple were to fall and this capstone were to be destroyed, then the waters of the deep would come back up to the surface and the entire world would be destroyed. And they didn't just fear this, but by this point they saw it as inevitable and were actually sort of looking forward to it. They were like, it's not just going to happen. We kind of need it to happen. Look how corrupt the world is. And every time they got conquered by someone, they were like, this is evidence that, the world is corrupt. That's why like every single one of our neighbors has ruled over our country throughout history. And so they kind of wanted it to happen. It was essentially a doomsday cult, because when it would finally fall, then the world could be destroyed and it could be purified and cleaned the way it was in the flood. Though this time it wouldn't just be like some water. No. It would be fire and everything would burn. And so they because the flood story, it ends with God promising to never do it again, because it's based on, the old flood myths from, Atrahasis and Ziusudra and Utnapishtim, and it's always like, okay, well, maybe we screwed up. We're not going to be that harsh on you in the future. But then they get some Zoroastrian influence where the world ends with fire. And they're like, well, it doesn't have to be a flood, and God said it wouldn't, but we can do fire just like Ahura Mazda's gonna do. And so you still get to have your great cleansing, and the fears of it, being a flood are still there. It's just when it happens again, God's not going to use water. He's going to use a river of fire the way Ahura Mazda will.
Okay, so couple things here, Jason. This is I don't want to get sidetracked. We got some super chats I'm going to jump to. I just want to say that's the scary part about a lot of modern evangelicals in America. They actually see, well, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Why? Because, well, your morals don't match my expectations of what we're supposed to be. We have trans people, we have this, we have that, and well, I can't wait for us to get defeated, or America's going to go down hard because of these things. And so they have this apocalyptic mindset, whether it be religious or political, it doesn't matter. It seems to be combined as both. And they're out here really pushing this whole notion. It's kind of a freakish thing. All we got to do is read history and see things don't end well when you have people who think that way and are encouraging, like, we want this to end. You know what? If America's not going to be the way I want it to be, I'm an American, you're an American, so I think it's important to make this point. If it's not the way I expect it to be, well, it might as well get destroyed. And sure enough, it will get destroyed. And I want it to. If it doesn't go the way I want it to be, or the way my book tells me how I understand it to be, that's scary that we have people who are empowered
and
actually think
and like
things.
this is where it comes from. Like, not Enoch in particular, but these groups of people who saw the world as on the brink of destruction, and not only feared its coming destruction, but also looked forward to it. And you can read about this like in Daniel. It's like these were desperate people living in horrible conditions, and they wanted everything to get better. And no matter how many generations passed, things did not get better. So they're like, okay, well, if it's not going to get fixed, maybe it can all just end. It was almost like this sort of like a doomsday suicidal mindset. These are desperate people who are writing these things. Okay. And this is how they viewed the world. Okay, it's not going to get better. Hopefully it'll just end. And, it's being represented here, in things like Daniel and Enoch and stuff like that, and Revelation. And unfortunately, it is being preserved by people who have latched on to the religions that have been spawned by these belief systems. People, they look at it, and even if their situations are much improved, they will still look at any minor inconvenience and just be like, you know what? the world needs to end.
Yeah,
I
this needs
can't
to
have
end.
my way. This is the worst it's ever been. It needs to end. you know, Amazon refuses to deliver that package today. All right, I'm ready for Armageddon. And yeah, okay, yeah, that is a bit of an
Of
exaggeration.
course, I
But
know you're being funny, but yeah.
I'm literally related to people who desperately look forward to the
Right.
day when the fire comes down. Like Skynet takes over and starts dropping the nukes, and they'll be like, "Yes, finally!" And it's like,
Yeah.
you're talking about a lot of dead people.
Yeah.
Like this is
Yeah.
horrible, and they're like, "Yeah, but it's a good thing." And
Yeah,
like
purge the
I
evil.
personally know people, and it's because of writings like this, and
I mean,
related material. This is where
I
it
must,
comes from.
Jason, I have to admit, and we have to do super chats. I just want to make this quick comment. I have to admit, at least Enoch's trying to give you a much better reason for why God wanted to destroy the earth. Okay. Because the earlier versions didn't quite,
Angel
if you go
sex
to
and
the,
makeup.
yeah, I mean, it's obviously better
It's the
than
root
just
of all
saying,
evil.
well, they're noisy like the Sumerian mythology. Oh, they're too noisy. We just need to flood them all.
Yeah,
And then the Bible wants to take it a little further to give God off the hook. But then Enoch really wants to say, I mean, they're vampire giant monsters. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Gotta get rid of those.
Apollos, thank you again for the follow-up. He said, oh, I meant pre-second temple is what I understand. So I think he was asking that. We kind of answered his super chat here on dating it. So
okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if the similitudes of Enoch could be actually I'm not sure if how much of any of Enoch would be considered like a pre second temple writing.
Right.
I think there are tidbits here and there that are pre second temple. Though you kind of get into the debate about when exactly the second temple period began. Like, okay, does it begin when Cyrus releases the exiles and people start going from Babylon back over to Jerusalem? Is that the beginning of it? Or did these Second Temple reforms come decades or generations or even centuries later? Because people have proposed anything from, like 540 BC all the way up to like 190 BC and everything in between. So, but I really think that the similitudes of Enoch are are contemporary with Daniel, or in the decades following. So, like say 160 to 120 BCE, somewhere around there. I think that's a good safe bet. Other Enochic material, though, I do think is a bit earlier. I think some of the material concerning the seven evil angels that were cast down, they're never given names. I think that is actually older than any other part in the Book of Watchers. I think the other material is a later later versions that were kind of added on. And
doesn't that
the
come
Book of
from the seven
Astronomy.
Apkallu? The seven Apkallu in the Sumerian mythology. I know that in the Babylonian mythology, it's seven Apkallu, Apkallu or O or something like that. They come down kind of warning and giving the knowledge to mankind, if I'm not mistaken, something like this.
That's a possibility, and it may have been sort of wrapped up in this lore, and them like sharing the knowledge is where the story of Azazel came from, as sort of a separate tradition from this from these seven angels. But there are some indications in the third section, the Book of Astronomy, that they're talking about because when they talk about angels, they keep referring to them as stars. Like angels and stars are the same things. Like when you look at the sky and you see stars, those are angels flying around up there. And in the Book of Astronomy, it tells us that these things, they were there to help us determine the dates of all the important rituals and festivals. And these seven were linked with the Atonement Festival. We know that the Atonement Festival was done, I believe, in early October. And at that point, you have the Pleiades appearing in the sky, and the Pleiades are 7 stars. There are more stars, but there are 7 really bright ones, and that's how they always refer to them, as the 7 stars of the Pleiades. And so it looks like they're talking about, this specific group of stars. And what happened was, in the Second Temple period, when they switched over to the Babylonian lunar calendar, from their probably Egyptian inspired solar calendar, when they did that, it messed up, all of their it messed up their festivals and all their rituals. And so the Atonement Festival was no longer being conducted at the right time. And so they were basing the time for their Atonement Festival off of the inaccurate lunar calendar. But then when you look over at the sky, you're seeing the wrong constellations coming out. And the constellations they're supposed to see, the Pleiades, it's not in the right spot in the sky anymore to match up with the dates of the Atonement Festival. And so the Second Temple priests are now conducting the festival under the wrong stars at the wrong time of the year. And this is leading to all of this corruption. And this is my own pet theory. I lay it out in one of the episodes of the podcast. Though I have presented this theory to biblical scholars who are familiar with Enoch. And I've gotten basically confirmation from everyone that I've shown it to. They're like, I do think that you're onto something here. Yeah, I actually go through.
Need you to hook. When we get done with this, I need you to hook me up with some emails for Enochian scholars at PhDs in the field, because I'd love to do some interviews on them, and maybe we could do some joint shows with them as well. But yeah, definitely. Please do. JC with the 666. Thank you, my friend, for the super chat. I
super
really
chat of
enjoy.
the beast.
I know. I really enjoy Dragons in Genesis. Thank you, Derek, for revealing it to me. Has Jason studied the Hellenistic influences on the Septuagint, e.g., American? And we talked about that briefly earlier. I just posted, for those who are, I want to hear your response, of course, but I just posted so everybody knows. Please go subscribe to Dragons in Genesis. It is in the chat. If you want to attain, if you want to be seated with the Son of Man at the right hand of God. Anyway, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so I'm sure he's referring to the book Berosus in Genesis, Manetho in Exodus from Gamirkan. I'm about halfway done reading that book right now. I have my signed copy on the bookshelf on the other side of this wall. My girlfriend got it for me about 2 years ago. Amazing book, very well researched and very well argued. I don't. Since I haven't finished reading it, I won't give an opinion, one way or the other. But I will say that it is a very fascinating book, and I think that anyone who is interested in that topic should definitely try to get their hands on a copy of it. It is rather expensive. It's about $200 because a lot of these scholarly press books are done in very small quantities, and it's very limited. It's not like a trade paperback where they print, hundreds of thousands. So it is a bit pricey to get your hands on it. I would suggest contacting Russell Gamirkan and, seeing, because sometimes authors have copies that they can send out, for less. And maybe there's a Kindle version that's, that'll be coming out at some point that you can buy for like, $20 or whatever. So get in touch with the guy. Very nice guy. Very responsive to emails. Hit him up. If you want a copy of that, and maybe he can help you out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Russell's a great guy. Highly encourage reading that. And then, of course, his book on Plato, the laws of the Bible, and going into Plato. Really interesting. Lel, hope I'm saying your name properly. Thank you for that super chat. In Enoch, it talks about the luminaries traveling through portals. In context of time, what are we to understand by the word portal?
Okay, so this is amazing, and you're going to find this mainly at the beginning of the Book of Astronomy, which is the 3rd section of First Enoch. This one, I did an entire episode about that section. It's really, really fascinating stuff.
What was the name of it? Do you know? I'll pull it up and advertise it.
I'm gonna, yeah, let me pull this up real fast. I'll show you. Let's see.
If you have a
here.
title, I have your YouTube pulled up. I could just literally type it in.
Yeah.
And boom.
So let me go back to this. When in Rome, Hammer Time.
And while he's doing that, just
all these things are named after like parables, similitude. Episode 52, Spirit in the Sky. All of those in that series about Enoch, which begins with episode 48 and ends with episode 54, they are all references to popular songs. So Tonight the Stars Revolt, Enoch knocking on heaven's door, Watch the Sky for Me, Rock the Caspiel, Spirit in the Sky, Hammer Time, The Beginning is the End. The End is the Beginning. That's the last one. So
I'm just posting that in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, episode 52, Spirit in the Sky. That's the one where I dig into the astronomy book, and that's where you're going to find my own personal pet hypothesis that the idea of the corruption of the world stems from the Second Temple switching over to a lunar calendar. Don't worry, when I finish the coverage of that section of Enoch, there's like this big disclaimer right in the middle of the episode. I'm like, what follows is just my own hypothesis. So if you don't want to hear anything from an amateur, then this is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you do want to hear it, then let's get started. And then we go on. So I will again issue that disclaimer now. That particular portion, the idea that the whole corruption of the world that you find, mentioned throughout First Enoch, the idea that it comes from switching from a solar calendar to a lunar calendar. You're probably not going to find any scholarship that mentions that. I never did. This is my own hypothesis. I lay out that little thesis and why I believe it with, all the relevant passages in First Enoch to support it. But it's just my own pet theory. Take it with a grain of salt. Now, as far as this,
what's the deal with the portals? Yeah.
So the luminaries, you find this at the beginning of that section. And what's going on there is really fascinating stuff. So what's going on there is they start talking about in the very beginning of that section that if you look at the sky, you'll notice that the sun, the moon, and the stars, they're coming out through these portals in the eastern sky. They call them like gates. And they then are carried by angels over the sky, inside the dome of the firmament. And then they go to the western sky and they exit the firmament through portals over there. And they have like 6 portals in the east and 6 in the west. And all the stars, the sun, the moon, they all come through these portals and they fly through there. And they talk about how if you look at those things every morning, the sun, it'll come through this one portal, but gradually it's moving toward the edge of that portal. And then in the next month, it doesn't come through that portal anymore. It comes through the next portal and the next portal all the way. And then, you have like, say, the summer solstice. And then gradually it starts moving back until it's all the way down again. And then it starts coming through. And what it is, they're talking about different portions of the eastern sky. And this is essentially how you build a device for tracking the movement of the sun so that you can basically keep track of the days of the year without having to put like tally marks up on the wall or have an iPhone, because they didn't have smartphones back then. That's something I just learned the other day. So what basically the way this would be is you could have like an observation room, like an old observatory, basically, and you'd have a window that would face east, or you could arrange this outside. You just need a clear view of the horizon, and you would have some sort of like a horizontal beam or a windowsill or something. And you would have a very specific spot where you would sit. And it would work best if you had, some small aperture to look through, like a beam that has a little hole in it, and you would put your eye up to it. That way your head is in the exact spot every single day. And then when the sun comes up on, say, December 24th, you go and you put a mark on the windowsill right where it's coming up. And then on December 25th, you put a mark, and the 26th. And you go through, and every day of the year, you put a little mark. And when you do this, you're going to notice that each day the sun rises at a slightly different spot. And eventually, it goes all the way to one edge, and it pauses there for a little bit. And then the next day, it's moved over a bit. And each day, as the sun rises, it's in a different spot, and it gradually moves back over. And they took this and they divided it into 6 different spots. And each of those would basically represent 2 different months of the year. You know, say one in the spring and one in the fall. Okay. And like the sun would basically travel back and forth across this, you know, and they would measure out each one. And each one of these sections, it was all like subdivided to 6 groups. And these were to represent months out of the year, and the sun would make 2 passes. And so you end up with 12 months. And so that's what they're talking about when they're talking about these portals. They're talking about sections in this sort of device that they would use to observe where the sun was coming up. And once you've marked this down, which will require just getting up before dawn and making a mark wherever the sun comes up each day, once you've done that for 1 year, at any point, if you want to know what day of the year it is, you just get up before dawn, you sit down, and when the sun's coming up, you put your head by that little aperture, and wherever the sun comes up, that's your date. And these little divisions that they have, on this little horizontal, this little horizontal plane was to just measure that. And so that's what they're talking about with these portals. You know,
Do
the
you think
sun is
that they
coming up through these
connected?
things.
This probably relates to the temple and the timing of keeping rituals and such as well,
Mhm.
I suspect, but also
Yeah.
agriculture, you name it, and survival and things like that. Did the angels that came down supposedly teach them these things as well, or supposedly? I don't know.
I think there is a mention about teaching people like the passage of time or something. Um, but they don't like specify in the text that it was about this calendar.
Okay.
So I think if they did do something like that, then maybe they were teaching them about the lunar calendar. And then you would have like, one more sin to lay at the angel's feet. One that's almost as bad as, learning makeup and eyeliner. So
Robert Herring, thank you for the super chat. Metatron, Enoch in disguise. Love the channel Dragons and
oh yeah.
Genesis.
Metatron is a fantastic figure. One of the coolest figures in like Jewish literature. There's actually debate as to what the name means. It might mean like his own throne, because he certainly gets that. Like he ascends to the highest point in heaven, and then he's rewarded with his own throne that he gets to sit on. Um, he's also, I think, in either second or third Enoch, he's called a lesser Yahweh. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. So they're recognizing him as being like almost a god in his own right. At one point, it's said to be the archangel Michael. At one point, it's said to be Yahweh. At one point, it's said to be Enoch. And what's curious is, these different figures like Yahweh and Enoch. I don't necessarily believe that they were always meant to be understood as entirely separate entities. Um, I think that there was a chance Enoch was understood to be a sort of earthly incarnation of Yahweh. And the reason is that we find out a lot of the same things, like a lot of the same details about both Yahweh and Enoch, especially in any text that mentions the name Metatron. So both of them were said to have been the first thing that El created. Where like the very beginning, before the sun and moon and stars, El created Yahweh, and then through Yahweh, he sort of channeled his power, and then everything else was made. And so so Yahweh is basically the firstborn of creation.
And where are we
He's
finding that?
also
Where is
oh
that
God,
found at?
I am trying to remember the exact text. I've got like about 5 different texts bouncing around in my head right now because I'm rereading
I'm just
First
saying, there's
Enoch.
someone in
And
the chat going, I don't believe that, So
yeah,
obviously,
I promise if you go looking for it, you'll find it. I'm just drawing a blank on exactly which text. I was reading like Second Esdras earlier today because of a possible Enoch connection that turned out to be garbage. But no, I've got like 50 different things in my head right now, and I cannot think of the specific one where it says that Yahweh was created. Like at the beginning of time, though there is a section in oh God, where was it? There actually is a reference to this in the Old Testament where Yahweh is basically the first thing that's created, and then he's the agent of the rest of creation. That does pop up briefly in the Old Testament, though it's more prominent in some of the apocryphal literature. And we have the same thing said about the Son of Man figure, that he was created at the beginning of time. We have this in the parables of Enoch. He was created at the beginning of time, and basically everything was then created through him. And we learn later that Enoch is the Son of Man. And so we have both Yahweh and Enoch both being created at the very beginning of time by El, and then everything is then created through them. And then their identity of both Yahweh and the Son of Man is hidden from the whole rest of the world. And then both the Son of Man and Yahweh become sort of manifest on earth in order to bring about the whole day of judgment. And this is the story that they also tell about Jesus. And so it looks like the Metatron is almost like a title for this figure, this pre-existent deity that is sort of a bridge between the highest point in heaven, the throne room of El Elyon, and the created world, the earth that we inhabit. And its purpose is mainly to just serve as that intermediary, to intercede on our behalf, to deliver messages from the throne of God to humans, and also to sit in judgment over the humans and the angels, which we also see in the case of Enoch, the Son of Man, Jesus, and Yahweh. So yeah, the literature concerning the Metatron is really fascinating stuff, and it looks like it may be another one of these titles of this supreme angel that sits above all other angels, which is also the role of Yahweh. He is the Lord of all the angels. I mean, that's in the name Yahweh Sabaoth.
Wow. There's so much to look into. I love this stuff. Jason Kakulo, thank you for that super chat. Fossils? Ancient saw 7-foot tall Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus fossil, so ancient giant demigod stories. Let me take a quick crack. This might be interesting just to speculate. Maybe they did. Maybe they saw some type of fossils and it helped inspire, like, these are massive bones. Where do these come from? That could play a role. But another thing I've heard, and then I'd love to get your thoughts, is Ronald Hindle, who's written on Hebrew Bible literature. He would take the opposite view of Gamirkin. He thinks that Hebrew literature does go way back, at least 7th, 8th century BC. And here are these Israelites, Jews, that are seeing these monumental structures. So they didn't have to see fossils. They saw massive structures, kind of like the pyramids. They see huge objects, walls of cities that they're like, how did that happen? being probably nomadic and not being situated and as a large civilization, they're thinking, hey, here are these ruins of giants, because there's no way the average Joe can build these. You have to be super strong and super big. So mythologies about giants were kind of constructed and created as a past idea that long ago the gods or whatever built these objects. And this is where they thought these come from. But it's interesting that you bring this up, Jason, is did they see fossils that might have been like, whoa, this is what makes us think there were giants in the ancient past? I don't know. What do you think?
Another thing is to not limit the possibility to human fossils. If you look at the descriptions of the Cyclops from the oldest Greek literature that talks about them, they're these giant, like one-eyed human or humanoids, and they have these two weird tusks. So they have one eye in the dead center of their head and two tusks, and they're just these very ugly, malformed people. If you look at the skeletal remains of the dwarf elephants that lived on the Greek Isles and actually throughout the Mediterranean, you realize that they're not talking about any sort of like 7-foot tall humans. They're talking about dwarf elephants, because like humans and elephants, we have the same bones. They're just arranged slightly differently. And if you take an elephant skeleton and you just scatter it on the ground and you look at this, you're going to say, oh, wow, that those look like human bones. And the skull of a dwarf elephant, it has this one giant hole in the dead center, and that's where the snout, the trunk goes. That's the nasal passage. And then it has these two tusks that stick down, exactly the way that these things are depicted, in Greek literature and art. And the prevailing theory is that there were people who encountered these skeletal remains, as these things only died out about like 10,000 years ago. And like you can still find the remains periodically. And so people, a lot of scholars believe that they just encountered these remains and said, oh, wow, like this is like a, some giant human. And then they told stories about it. And so like, we have to remember that a lot of these people, when they encountered something, they didn't exactly know what it was, like what it belonged to. And, like at some point, did they encounter an elephant or an elephant skeleton and look at that and say, like, what kind of person did that come from?
Yeah.
Of course, like when we see this, it clearly, like, look how it's arranged, it's an elephant, it's some kind of,
I just wanted to kind of show
animal.
like
Stand it up, and you're talking about a cyclops.
You kind of wonder, right? I mean, and I'm not.
Yeah,
you're speculating here, and I'm not. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody's going to the bank on this, but it is an interesting point to say. Like here, we have fossils of an actual elephant. That if you were to see that kind of bone structure and the kind of art that starts to come out of the Greek world,
especially since a lot of them depicted them with tusks, two little, like an orc from Lord of the Rings.
I'm looking for one of the Greek cyclops with the tusk image in art. That's what I'm looking for, but let me do this. Greek cyclops.
So I mean, even look at in the mid 1800s when the first dinosaur fossils were discovered, they had no idea how to put these things together, and they came up with some pretty bizarre arrangements for these things. And even well into the 20th century, they were still arranging them incorrectly. So, if they saw any bones and they didn't know what they went to, they could easily draw incorrect assumptions about them. And another thing is, some of these people, they were also just trying to explain things that they found in nature. Great rivers, they weren't carved out by erosion. They didn't know what erosion was. They were made by giant water dragons. These snakes, these magical snakes that would like breathe fire and stuff, and they would slither in the ground, and it would carve out a river, and then water would come through. And the reason it had like all these little like different tributaries or a river delta was because it was sort of like a hydra. It had multiple heads, and so the end of it would branch off into like 7 different necks. Like they didn't see some gigantic, Titanoboa skeleton somewhere. No, they just saw a river, and it looked similar to the
Slithery
path made
snake.
by a snake that goes through the sand. And, hey, you know what? I bet a gigantic snake made that river. That's how the water got in there like that. A huge snake carved it out. There are stories about, there are Jewish stories about mountain ranges that came from gigantic cows, like these kaiju cows and stuff. So I
I
don't
was
think we
just
should
reminded
necessarily
of
try to look for a natural explanation when we have the very real possibility that people were just making up stories to try to explain the world. Like in the Psalms, it tells us that lightning comes from a man who lives in the clouds, and he has a magic bow that shoots lightning bolts.
right.
Yahweh gets up there and he has a bow, and when he gets angry, he starts shooting lightning bolts at the ground and at other clouds. Now they never saw like a something that looked like a person up in the clouds. They just thought, man, what's all that going on up there? And then they made up stories about it. So the stories about these giants, like they could have just been making up stories to explain something. They also could have been making up stories that were allegorical. They meant something else. And so the stories of these, corrupt figures were, they maybe represented another group of people, the actions and the corruption of these other priests that were ruining the perfect religion that these other people believed that they had. And if you read the book of Enoch, that type of idea, it permeates the text. It is very critical of the Second Temple priests. It calls them like a bunch of filthy heathens. They're responsible for destroying the world according to their view. So it, like these giants, it could just represent, the government in Jerusalem, the armed guards, things like that. They were very critical of these people. So it may not have been inspired by something that they just discovered. It may have just been, their way of calling these people, a bunch of filthy heathens.
I was going to show real quick just to tease people an image of like a sea serpent, if you will. And you were talking about the river, but also in that new God of War game that well, it's not new now, but a couple years old. That God of War serpent, the world serpent. And I figure why not tease everybody with a quick clip of this in the game. Let's get it right about here.
Throw our weapons into the water? Guess that won't be a problem for you. Are you gonna do it?
The axe did not return. Hang on, boy!
Okay!
What is this?
It's the world serpent.
Pretty cool. I figure I'd tease everybody with a little
Yeah, so the
something.
Jews, they actually believed that Leviathan was even bigger than that. They believed that Leviathan encircled the entire world. And so you have like the disk Earth and your continent, which was only I don't know, maybe about 2,000 miles wide at the most, is sitting in the dead center, and it's surrounded by an ocean. So we all live on like one island in the Middle East, and the edge of that ocean where the firmament, because it's a big dome like a snow globe, it comes down and it touches the edge of the water, and that edge where the firmament comes down and is near the water, the Leviathan encircles that entire thing, like just on the inside of that. And in some depictions is even like biting its own tail like a giant Ouroboros. And because there's like the world, the giant disc Earth just isn't big enough for this monster to stretch out. And so you're talking about something that's, like 7,000 miles long or something. And so these are the types of stories that they told, and the beliefs that they had. And they had this giant animal that was maybe a hippopotamus or maybe a giant cow, called the behemoth. And it was the mate to the Leviathan, at least in the stories where the Leviathan was female. And they were separated at the beginning of time because if they ever mated and had babies, they would be so heavy that the stone pillars that held up the world would shatter and the whole world would fall down. And there was a third one called the Z's. This was like a giant condor. And it was so big that if it stood in the deepest part of the ocean, its head would nearly reach the top of the firmament. And it once laid an egg up in the mountains near Jerusalem, and that egg ruptured, and the yolk came down and flooded 7 cities. Okay, that's how big the egg was. Okay, and so these are some of the stories that these people told. And
Wow.
so like they had some pretty crazy myths. They had like kaiju cows and giant birds and stuff. So that was pretty cool.
Thank you for that. Paul Kickling says Metatron equals Meta Chariot equals Christ in all dimensions. Thank you for the super chat.
I'm not sure what to make of that one. And we have to remember that so we're looking at this from like a more modern perspective. We're trying to use the meanings of these different like prefixes and stuff. But that's not necessarily like how the word was written. Because there's actually like a bunch of I think like 3 different ways that it could have been written. And so like the word meta might not have actually been part of it. So you have to like get someone who actually like can read ancient Hebrew and like read what the thing says, and then try to use like context clues and compare it to other words. Which is why there's no clear consensus as to what the name Metatron actually means. There was a lecture series I was listening to the other day that was talking about it and gave, I think, like 3 different possibilities and good arguments for all 3. So yeah, it's one of those you can't really. It's difficult to come up with a good explanation for it, and if you try to base any opinions off of that explanation, you're going to run into trouble because it very easily could mean something else entirely. So you have to be careful with that one.
Yeah, I would speak to a linguist or philologist, something like that. So that way you're not like jumping to like this word sounds like this word, therefore it must be, or whatever. I do want to take us back if I can. Very hard while still running, truck driving and stuff. So please help him out. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel. I really want everybody to go and support the guests that I have on. He's got the YouTube channel and the website, dragonsandgenesis.com. Go check out his website. Help support him out. You want to buy him a coffee? Buy him a couple coffees. Whatever you want to do there. This is a way to support him. And, of course, MythVision Podcast, working our butt off. I've already dropped a bunch of John Dominic Crossan interviews. I've got more to edit. I've got James Tabor interviews. I'm trying to get the courses ready. I'm trying to move my house. There's so much stuff we're doing. Oh, and this one right here, Religion for Breakfast. We did one on Jesus the Magician.
Oh, yeah.
Highly recommend you go check us out. Support us there. You can also message us. Any final words from you, Jason, as we're wrapping things up?
Yeah, so two things. One, these topics, which I find extremely fascinating, while they do have a significant social impact, because so many people believe them and base their lives, their actions, their vote off of some of these ancient texts. Another way to look at it, though, is as a piece of literature, and to read these things and understand them, and and research these topics can be extremely rewarding in its own right, just to learn about these things and sharing what with people, about these texts, sharing those things that you've learned with people who do hold these beliefs can actually change those beliefs. Just about every month I get emails and Facebook messages from followers of my podcast who are religious, who have now started to question things. And every few months I get deconversion stories from former Christians and Muslims who came to my podcast to get a better understanding of Christianity and ended up becoming atheists, even though I don't try to deconvert anyone. I just research the literature and share it. And so I would encourage people to have better conversations about these things, to read about these topics, to study these things, get a good Bible commentary, like the Ehrman's commentary, and read it, and come to a better understanding in your own right, and then have conversations about these texts with your religious friends, not to try to deconvert them, but to just try to share information to get them to think deeper and to provide resources so they can learn more. Because as everyone knows, the more someone learns about their religion, the more difficult it is to believe it. And so they can also learn more. And the last thing I would say is, if you can't contribute financially to any of these projects, I know that like right now times are tough for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So if you can't support us, on Patreon, on Ko-fi, on any of these sites, something that you can do to show your appreciation, to support our work, is to just go in, like videos, post some comments, share these things on social media. If you take one of these videos or an episode and you get someone else to listen to it, well, then maybe that person in the future will become a Patreon supporter. And so now you are partially responsible for the money that person is sending over, and these things, the increased views that you're responsible for, from yourself and from sharing it, that adds up to ad revenue from YouTube, and that helps us to buy more books, to buy better equipment, and to do these things and to bring you more content. So reviews on iTunes, posting comments on social media and on YouTube, and sharing these episodes with people, that contributes more than you realize. So if you can't donate financially, you have too many other things that you have to pay for, or too many other Patreons that you're already supporting, and another $5 a month, you can't quite make it. That's okay. Like some things, share some things, post some things, and put in some comments, because that also helps, and it helps a lot more than people realize. And also, when we see those things, when we're having a bad day and we're grinding through the research, and the video editing and everything else, and then we get an alert because someone posted a comment about how much they appreciate what we do, that helps. Because like at the end of the day, Derek and I are a couple of humans. We're not just like content machines, we're people. And sometimes we have horrible days. And sometimes we have days where it's very difficult to sit down and do the work because we feel like garbage. And when we see that encouragement, when we see that we're appreciated, you have no idea how much that actually means. And so a comment, sharing it on Facebook, anything like that, that has an impact. That is a way you can help when you can't put in some dollars. So consider doing that if you like what we do.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really hope everybody goes subscribe to your channel. Check out your shows. They are fun to listen to, and you learn a lot. And never forget, we are MythVision.